All right, I'm
I thought it
delighted
was great.
to welcome you all to this session. We are going to be pursuing the life well lived question with, I think, particular interest and debate in this context. Arthur just gave a really wonderful talk about happiness, and Tamar is a real delightful expert on this topic. I want to begin actually not with happiness, but with unhappiness. We had, at the end of Ideas Festival Health, the Surgeon General here. He's just issued a large advisory on what he calls the epidemic of loneliness. And in that advisory, he cites a number of very sobering statistics. The kinds of things about how, for example, college students, over 2/3 articulate the idea that mental health is in some way impeding their studies. The question of connection or social isolation is hitting between 1/3 and 2/3 as well. We can talk more about those kinds of questions. What is particularly striking about these statistics is, of course, that they're happening within the kind of society that is, in one sense, incredibly successful. The United States is a global power, very few international rivals. We have a tremendous amount of wealth and success in all kinds of ways. But for some reason, we also have these incredible rolling crises of isolation, of anxiety, and generally of unhappiness. So we're going to talk about that in various ways. My panel is incredibly interesting and exciting. This is like a philosopher's dream. So Tamar Gendler is Dean of Arts and Sciences at Yale and a philosopher and writes incredibly well on these topics. And Arthur Brooks is a professor at the Kennedy School at Harvard and also has taken on a real interest in probing underneath the question of what it means to be a human and what it means to be happy. So Tamar, let me start with you. When you think about the state of our society and the kind of civilization that we have, how do you think of our situation that we're in, and then what kind of diagnosis would you begin to give?
Good. So thank you, Sam, and it's an honor to be here with Arthur as well. So I concur with the facts. I do think it is an astounding moment that we have a circumstance where every external factor that one would think is necessary for human thriving is in place. But even against the backdrop of an apparently fulfilling opportunity for life, people in this room all have enough to eat. People in this room all have opportunities to engage in things that are intellectually stimulating. Nonetheless, there's some sort of residual feeling of mismatch between what it would take to flourish and the ways in which one is interacting with the world. So I think first that the diagnosis that there is something awry is correct. And the reason that I'm convinced of that is that one of the most striking things about the literature on loneliness and unhappiness is that it cuts across social classes. So it's not merely a matter of a feeling of deprivation with regard to the real goods that are required for human beings to survive. With regard to diagnosis, I guess I would say three things. First is I want to say a little bit about parts of the soul and what Arthur had to say about the ways in which the parts of the brain can be in order. Then I want to say something about the way in which for individuals there may be something missing, and then some things about the structure of society. So Arthur just gave a brilliant talk where he described the fact that our brains roughly have 3 roles that they play and 3 segments that are assigned to those roles. That is, we have a part that's basically involved in perception and taking in features of the world that are in our ambient environment. We have a place that has the job of processing what it is that we get perceptually and basically telling us how instantaneously we should respond to that. That's the limbic system. And then we have a part of our brain that is designed to engage in a kind of thoughtful regulation. And one of the really striking things, which Arthur knows well, is that this image of the soul or the mind or the brain having three parts is actually 2,500 years old at least. In Plato's Republic, we get a description of the human being as having appetite, basically a set of responses to the world that are required for procreation and sustenance. That is the sorts of attitudes that you have that cause you to be attracted and aroused or to have desire to consume. There's a spirited part, which is concerned with your social status and the ways in which you're perceived by others, whether you're honored or denigrated. And there's a part of you which is what Plato calls the charioteer, the rational part of the soul, that's responsible for the thoughtful engagement with things beyond the body. And the entire theme, or one of the entire themes of a lot of Plato's work, is about how you get those parts into harmony. And Arthur just gave us 3 excellent strategies for thinking about how you get those parts aligned. But notice that there is a presupposition in what Arthur said and in what Plato's saying, which is some ways of being in the world are better for us than other ways of being in the world. And so the fact that as human beings we thrive not just when our soul is in harmony, but when it's in harmony in the right way, I think is the first point. The second is that in order for them to be in harmony in the right way, we need a sense that the world has meaning. And if you think about what it is that makes people happy and engaged and excited, it's things like rooting for a sports team. It's things like, I went to Mary Louise Kelly's brilliant session with Kelly Corrigan. It's things like sitting down at dinner with your family and feeling connected. So we have a sense of what it is for there to be meaning in the world. And the third point, and the reason I think this is challenging, is that it is possible to engage in the world in this meaningful way only if you have both the internal tools to do so and the external structures to support those tools. Yeah. And I view most of the ancient Western philosophical tradition as being an exploration of what are the tools within ourselves and what are the tools within society for structuring human experience in such a way that the world has meaning and that the meaning that the world has is tracking something fundamentally valuable about it.
I mean, so I think there will perhaps be some tensions that show up in our conversation between our 3 views. But one thing that I think is very striking about what you just said, which I think we all share, is actually a fundamental sense of optimism about this question. And I think that is in contrast to the way that this appears in much of the society. I think there are many people that do feel the internal tension of the 3 parts of the soul that you're describing, being ripped apart in various ways, and not having optimism that you could actually resolve that tension or that there would be tools to do so. And so, Arthur, I would actually be really interested in your sense, when you have been working on the happiness topic, what are the most robust tools that you feel like you've come across that do feel sort of countercultural in that particular sense?
Thanks for that question, that just beautiful answer that you gave, Tamara. What a delight. I'm going to steal the whole thing. Hey, I got a column to write every Thursday, so yeah, so I'm looking for content. I want to answer that in a slightly different way because I come from a different background. So when I was in graduate school, I was studying applied mathematics, and I thought I was answering technical questions. I was doing applied operations research for the U.S. Air Force on how to win wars using super technical mathematical models. But here's what I really learned from that experience at becoming an applied mathematician. There's 2 kinds of problems in life, really 2 kinds of problems in life. One kind of problem is really complicated, and the other kind of problem is really complex. Now, mathematicians know the difference between those two things. In the dictionary, they're considered to be synonyms, but they're not synonyms. Complicated problems are incredibly hard to solve, but with enough genius and computational horsepower, you can solve the problems and replicate the solution again and again and again and again perfectly. Building a jet engine is an enormously complicated problem. Building a toaster is a complicated problem. Until about 100 years ago, there were no toasters. And today, it's so complicated, if you try to build your own toaster in your garage, you'll probably burn your house down. But you can get one for 15 bucks. So what happens with a complicated problem? Once you crack it, it's cracked. And you do it with engineering. That's how you solve complicated problems. The other kind of problem in life is complex. Complex problems are super easy to understand, but literally impossible to solve. So for example, you want to watch a football game. You talked about that just a minute ago, a sports game. Why do you want to watch the sports game? Because it's complex and you can't solve it beforehand. You got to watch it to figure out the solution. What do you want in life? I know what you want in life. You want love. Why is love so exciting? Because it's complex. You know exactly what the solution is. You just don't know how to get it. You got to be fully alive to get it. So in other words, you have to live to solve a complex problem, and one day you solve it, and the next day you don't. But that's all of the really interesting stuff in life. All the boring stuff in life is complicated. All, you know, the toothbrush and the jet plane and you know, how we got here to the Aspen Ideas Festival and all that. I'm glad we've got that stuff, but that's not what keeps you up at night. What keeps you up at night is the love relationships in your life, and those are all complex. Here's the problem. We have all the same complex problems we've had since, you know, Homo sapiens left Africa 300,000 years ago. But now all we have for those complex problems is complicated solutions, and they don't fit. We're getting richer, and we have more technology, and we have more government, and we have more, and we feel less. What do I want? Let's say, I don't know, I want companionship and something warm and something I can look forward to coming. I want a cat. Why? Because a cat is complex. You know exactly, you know, the scratching and the warmth and the kibble and going outside, but you never know what it's going to do because it's adaptive and it's random, and that's the beauty of it, right? And so I say, I want a cat. And what I get instead is a toaster. I don't want a toaster, I want a cat. But Silicon Valley and the engineering culture and the welfare state, they say, I know you want a cat, but here's a toaster. And I say, I didn't want a toaster. Well, here's a better toaster. How about 10 more toasters? How about 50 more toasters? My house is full of toasters, and I don't have one cat. And that's what's wrong with our world today.
So actually, to pick up on that quickly, so there was a story from February about a man in Belgium who committed suicide after speaking to an AI. And both his wife and psychiatrist said specifically that he would not have done so if he had not been interacting, you know, between 8 and 12 hours a day with this thing. In particular, the story was that he became convinced, somehow through interaction, that the AI would solve global climate change if he then committed this kind of suicide. It's a really, really sobering story, in part because of the technological component, but I think that's not actually the sobering part. The sobering part is the human question. What is it that makes life in this kind of society, as we're living it, susceptible to that kind of an interaction? I want to bring that up early because I think as we're talking about the question of happiness and the possibility of optimism, I'd like to begin with actually with the question of suffering and how is it that we handle what happens when life doesn't align with our set of expectations. I'd actually like to have both of you comment on that question of suffering. Maybe, Arthur, we can start with you, and then we can go to Tamar.
We have an attitude towards suffering which is normal and human, which is we want it to stop. And the reason is because negative basic emotions are aversive to us, and they're a signal that something's wrong. The problem is that we're blinkered in our understanding of how we're supposed to react to negative basic emotions. So those of you who heard my talk before, I had to give a whole talk on emotional self-regulation. But here's the key point, as far as I'm concerned. You don't actually want your suffering to stop. You want the thing that's causing the suffering to stop. And we have a culture now that's all about stopping the suffering and not dealing with the underlying problems. And the underlying problems are the lack of love. The lack of love in our society and in our lives. I mean, our great Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, he writes about loneliness. That's a lack of love. Our polarized culture is a lack of love. Our turning from humans to machines is a lack of love. The fact that it's harder and harder for people in their 20s to find romantic attachment, it's a lack of love. The fact that religious observation is in decline is because of a lack of love. And so what do? Well, we feel pain because we're supposed to feel pain. It's natural to feel pain. That suffering is a signal that something's wrong and that we're humans and that we're alive and we're supposed to feel that suffering. But our reaction to that is, man, I got to make that suffering stop so I can continue to live in isolation looking at a screen and not hate it so much. That's exactly the wrong perspective on this. That's exactly the wrong lesson for us to take from this. And instead, what we're doing is we're treating something as fundamentally untreatable, and my friends, it's only going to get worse unless we actually have a new perspective and a new strategy for dealing with the underlying problems.
That was actually really a beautiful answer, and you made a wonderful analogy in your previous talk about the way in which caffeine can imitate a neurochemical that causes us to be sleepy and latch on and replace the thing which was actual with a surrogate that the brain as a system, as a mechanical system, responds to in the way that it would to the object which was designed for that. And one of the extraordinary things that happens as we develop more and more knowledge about human beings and what motivates them is that we create the equivalent of processed foods for the emotions. So we have processed foods which play to our desire for sweet and fatty, which are evolutionarily adaptive in a situation of scarcity. And we have all sorts of social tools which play to the desire to feel connected and attached, but we're actually just surrogates rather than the actuality. And the fundamental question of ancient philosophy and of most religious traditions is, how do I get from that which is surface to that which is real? How do I move from responding to appearance to engaging with reality? And I would say in the specific question that you asked about suffering, there is something fundamental about suffering, which is the experiential reality of being a being in the world who has a particular perspective. So one of the striking things about AI is that it has objectivity, but it doesn't have subjectivity. There's no perspective. It is a view from nowhere, as opposed to a view from a particular perspective. Suffering is an unbelievable opportunity to exercise the capacity to think both subjectively, because feeling suffering fully and powerfully and recognizing the way in which it is a signal of something in the world that you wish weren't the case, and that is the case. If you take the factiveness of the suffering, there is a feature of the world which is not in keeping with my desires, over which I don't have control, and it is a fact that it mismatches how I want things to be, and it is a fact that the world is filled with things that mismatch the way that I want them to be. There's an opportunity for actually an attitude of something like awe in the face of suffering, which is a recognition of what it is really telling you.
So since we're already doing philosophy, and since my job at the Aspen Institute has the word philosophy in it, I do want to pick up on this for a second. So there's a famous passage where Socrates famously gets executed for corrupting the youth, which is a fine occupation. And he, in the telling of this account, he's stuck in prison, and an aristocrat comes to him and says, "What kind of aristocrat would I be if people know that I'm your friend and I don't use my cash to get you out of this situation? Also, I heard they're going to kill you in 3 days." And Socrates immediately shuts him down, and he says, "Under no circumstance am I going to take this offer. It's better to suffer injustice than to do injustice." Now, I want to bring that up because there's a complication in that principle, right? So I think I actually think in some ways that that principle would be controversial now. There's an aspect of the question of happiness. If we are looking for happiness, getting killed by poison seems like it's an immediate end to that project of being happy. And there's something to that, right? Like, if we're alive and if we think vitality is the right thing, is it the case that we should actually do everything we can to perpetuate that interest and perhaps to make sure that we get all the things we want, ambition and success and relationships that we want in the right order, wealth? Or is there something in the Socratic principle that actually undergoing the hard thing, the suffering thing, is better? And in that dialogue, he says specifically, it's better for me that I should undergo this injustice than that I should cause one. Maybe Arthur, what's your feeling about?
Well, the idea that all of the good stops as soon as he dies is a very controversial principle.
Good.
Why? Because we don't know, do we? I'm a Christian. I actually don't think it stops. And I don't think Socrates actually thought it stops either. Many of you disagree with me. Many of you don't know. So the bottom line is what we understand is physical death. What we don't know is the cessation of existence. That we truly don't understand. I mean, the whole idea of the wager of Pascal is to say, I'm going to act with virtue just in case. I'm going to act with faith just in case. I remember my father was a deeply religious guy, and he used to tithe. He used to pay 1/10 of his income to charity. And I said, Dad, and I'm an economist, right? So I'd say, yeah, pre or post-tax? Right? And my dad said pre-tax. And I said, pre-tax, Dad, come on, man, why? And he said, just in case. Right? Okay, so anyway, you get my point. That your own religious proclivities notwithstanding, we don't know about the cessation of existence. And so therefore, we don't know the time frame and the discounting for the essence of our virtue, do we? It's a much more practical way of living to be virtuous without regard to that, one might say. And I think Socrates was saying that in point of fact. Yeah. That's not just a question of martyrdom or integrity. It might be the most intensely practical situation in which you could put yourself. I dare say that I hope I would do the same thing. I sort of suspect I wouldn't. I sort of suspect I would have my friend bail me out. Because, at the end of the day, I don't really know about the afterlife. But I have a lot of love and respect for that. And I know a lot of people who actually think that particular way. And I think that the world actually would be quite a better place if there were more Socrates in our world today, notwithstanding our incertitude about what actually happens beyond the gates of our physical death.
Tamar, can I ask you a kind of closely related question, which is, when you think about the secret of happiness, how does it relate to control? So part of what we do when we think about happiness is we say, okay, I'm going to order my life so that all these things that I want are structured into it. Whereas I think the Socratic principle that we're talking about is almost the opposite. It's the feeling like it's actually in the relinquishing of certain kinds of control. It's not getting rid of control entirely that is actually the key here. You've written and speak really movingly on these kinds of principles for structuring a good life. Maybe you just talk about that a bit.
Yeah, good. And let me connect it to the earlier Socratic question. So, contrary to my religious friend here, I think two of the most fundamental facts about our human experience are its finitude and its subjectivity. But accompanying those is an incredible capacity to appreciate that which is infinite and that which is objective. And my sense is that one of the best ways to deal with both our finitude and our subjectivity, with the fact that we are a limited piece of an infinite universe and that we are one perspective on a world that is co-constituted by a multiplicity of perspectives and perhaps also by something objective, is to balance at all times how it is that we best deal with our finitude and how it is that we best deal with our subjectivity. So the way that the question was framed about the Socratic remark, that at this point I am going to take finitude for this life which I have lived as a chance to connect myself to what is most deep and most true and most beautiful in the world, which is the capacity that we have to transcend the view that is the only view we ever genuinely occupy, which is our own view, and somehow go beyond that by thinking from a perspective other than ourselves.
So there's almost a tension between the views that you have, which is, on the one hand, it's possible to take the Socratic principle because you'll get more later. And in your case, I think you're saying you take the Socratic principle because actually it's just good now.
Yes.
There's a feature of coming into right order for yourself, even if there's no further reward of any kind. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, for sure. I mean, that's, but actually it's not a tension.
Okay, good.
Right? No, it's not a tension at all, because the truth of the matter is that no one knows. And if it turns out you resolve the paradox of this by saying it's better now and it might be better later, I think we've solved the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, good. But so I would say it may be what Plato calls the highest good, both intrinsically and instrumentally valuable, or it may be merely intrinsically valuable and of no instrumental utility because there's no being to whom that utility could attach. So agreed on that. But then the question is, given that we're these finite subjective beings, what sorts of tools and strategies are available to us if we want to bring our souls into order, as the ancient philosophical Western tradition would put it, or if we want to have our prefrontal cortex control our limbic system, as we just heard in the previous talk, both of which I see as being similar projects. And I think it's no accident that the kinds of strategies that Arthur Brooks presented in the last talk really echo ancient strategies, and actually in all three cases we're grounded in them. So we basically have...
Maybe before you start, actually, I think maybe put this in context a little bit. So part of what we see in the statistics about young people is a sense that the infinity of choice is itself crippling. So when you talk to people about making college decisions, when you talk to them about what kinds of career paths they want to take, or what they want to do with their lives, the feeling of the wildlife on the highway being frozen in front of a terrible decision suddenly can pass over many people. And the question there is this choice genuinely open in any direction that you want to take it? Or is there some principle? Is there some way that you can make a good or a bad choice? I think this is, to take something that we were talking about in another session, this is part of this crisis of habit that people have. So the reason that Jordan Peterson has come to such prominence is in part because he's telling people, here's a story about everything, and it's a story about you, and that's why you should make your bed.
Yeah.
And that is a certain version of giving you a structure for life. I want to hear from you what kind of structure, is that good to have a structure for life? Is that an important feature of happiness? And if so, how does that operate?
Good, but I want to start by challenging with the tool which I got from my friend, which is I think you're describing a complicated problem as if it were a complex problem.
Reasonable.
That is to say, people are thrown into a tizzy when there is a large number of possibilities, but a finite number. So I would say the problem of choice that people face is not that there's an infinite, but that there is perhaps an indefinite, and at the very least, an overwhelming finite. And in general, the question is, how do we, finite beings in a really complicated world, respond to circumstances and situations instinctively in a way that echoes what we would like to do reflectively. And in a lot of ways, the talk that Arthur Brooks just gave was about some tools that we have. And I would say in the ancient philosophical tradition, you have a pair of tools that are inside you and a pair of tools that are outside you. So in the Stoic Epictetus tradition, you have the capacity of stepping away from your emotional responses and viewing the world from an objective stance. And that gives you one really good mechanism for having your responses at the moment line up with your responses on reflection. But you also have in Aristotle what you might think of as almost the opposite, which is the importance of cultivation of a habitual response, which is deeply part of what is specific about you, not what is general about the situation. And then we have a counterpart in the political philosophical tradition. So we have in Aristotle a recognition, shared by Confucius and many others, of the crucial role that social structures play in incentivizing behavior. And then we have in Plato a discussion of the incredibly powerful role that art and what we consume aesthetically plays. Being aware that those four things, what sorts of attachment and detachment you have to the world, what sorts of habits you cultivate, what sorts of social structures you embed yourself, and what sorts of aesthetic experiences you allow yourself to have, recognizing that those are the four tools that are available to finite subjective beings seems to me to be the most important insight that one can have.
Can you both give like a couple of concrete tips?
Yeah, for sure. Tamar's blowing my mind right now. It's like yeah, for sure. I mean, because the truth of the matter is that Tamar's an incredibly sophisticated philosopher. Here's the reason we need to understand what Tamar's saying. Here's the reason that no joke. Here's the reason that we need to study philosophy. Philosophy has the solution to this problem. You want to get away from complicated solutions to complex problems? Stop looking for the monistic, materialistic answer to the questions. Yeah. You have these deep questions. And so what are the answers that we're getting? Make your bed. Get on Instagram. Do keto. These are not going to solve your problems, your complex and adaptive human problems. What's going to do it? She's got the answer. You know what it is? You know what the philosophers do? Think about the questions. Yeah. Stop looking for the answers and start thinking about the questions themselves. This is what she's saying right now. I think. This is. Okay. So let me give now. Give me a concrete example. Okay. So because I have the transcendental nature of a goat. So let me give you really. One of the biggest problems that people have in looking for happiness is the search for meaning. Viktor Frankl, his most famous book was Man's Search for Meaning, and he said if you find a sense of meaning, you're going to be happy. As defined, as he defines happiness, which I think is a legitimate understanding of it. Now, philosophers will tell you that what's the meaning of life is the wrong question. There's really three embedded questions.
Not this philosopher.
What's that?
I like that question. But yeah.
The three meaning questions are about coherence, purpose, and significance. Coherence is, why do things happen the way that they do? Purpose is, what's the direction of my life? And significance is, what's my life worth? Is really, am I significant, is what it comes about. Yeah. Now, I have found, just to be very practical about this, and to try to apply all the brilliant stuff that Tamar can do as a trained philosopher, to say, here are the two questions that if you contemplate these things, which I've seen in my research, if you contemplate, you don't have to have the right answers. You have to contemplate these two questions if you want to have if you want to stop the crisis of meaning in your life. Okay, here they are. These are the two questions. They're heavy. You need to look for answers by contemplating the questions. Number one, why are you alive? You need to contemplate that question. Number two, for what would you be willing to die? Look for answers. In looking for the answers, you find the solutions. Now, this is a process that in all philosophical and religious traditions is called discernment. The ancient Greeks would talk about sunesis. The Buddhists in Pali would talk about panna. We Catholics, we talk about the discernment of spirits of St. Ignatius of Loyola. But it's all basically the same thing. Okay, so these two questions. Why am I alive? And for what am I willing to die? And when you see people contemplating these questions for the first time, holy cow, it's a truly life-changing thing. Yeah. My own son, I have 3 kids, and I have a middle son, which is a problem. His name is Carlos. And, Carlos, it was just, in high school, it was like, Carlos is failing math. Carlos got a D in history. Carlos took out the car, and we don't know where he is. Carlos didn't show up today. I had a frequent flyer program into the principal's office, right? And my wife, who's like a complete optimist, she's from Barcelona, she's like, at least we know he's not cheating. And it was just, the worst. And he wasn't even having fun. He wasn't, because he was lost. My son was lost. And so he was, a senior in high school, and I said, you can't go to college. You're not going to find the answers to these questions. You're not even going to be exposed to these questions in college. You need to go do something hard by yourself. This was not all nobility on my part, by the way. I just didn't want to pay for college with those grades. And, and so he goes to be a wheat farmer in Idaho, a dryland wheat farmer in Idaho. He's picking rocks out of the soil 16 hours a day and mending fences and cutting down dead trees and driving a harvester and didn't see people for days at a time. And then after 2 seasons, my son joins the U.S. Marine Corps. And now he's a Special Forces Marine, 4 years in. My son is a scout sniper in the U.S. Marine Corps 3-5 out of Camp Pendleton. This is a super scary job for me as dad. My son goes on field trips. Yeah, where are you? Can't turn on my locator, Dad. It's scary stuff for me as dad. But you know what? He's finding answers to those questions. I know, because he's 23 years old. My son's married at 23 years old of his own volition, and I say, Carlos, why are you alive? And he says, because God made me. And I say, Carlos, for what would you be willing to die? For my faith, for my family, and for the United States of America, and our allies, So if you're not from the United States, he would die for you too. And those aren't necessarily your answers, and those aren't necessarily my answers, but man, those are solid answers. And they came pursuant to an exploration of these big questions. That is the practical way to apply the brilliance of what the philosophers have been trying to teach us. Find the questions and go away and think about them. And you might just find the complex answers to your complex human problems.
We'll go,
Yeah. I'll take that for Carlos.
So we'll go to Q&A in a couple minutes. Before that, Tamar, maybe give a couple of examples of what Arthur's talking about, this kind of interrogation of what it means to be human and the confrontation of finitude. How does that actually work out in a life?
Yeah, thank you. What I will say is the philosophers that I presented abstractly are actually unbelievably practical in terms of the specific advice that they give. So Epictetus, who gives us the Stoic tradition, writes, some things are up to us and some things are not up to us. The Serenity Prayer, which expresses that thought, is just a summary of Epictetus. And the question is, how do you have that ready to hand? How do you make that something that's available to you always? How do you internalize these things? And I would say the other 3 strategies that we get are tools for internalizing this fundamental realization, that some things are up to us and some things are not up to us, and the things that are up to us are fundamentally our reactions. So
can I just say,
yes,
there is something wildly countercultural about that again.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think that the kind of habit that we are given is the reason that you need to make sure that you have success and wealth is so that you have a constant stream of things just flooding into your mouth. And that's a reasonable strategy, and it's a thought about happiness. But I think what you're describing is exactly the opposite of that in all kinds of respects.
So there's a argument in Aristotle, which is an argument that there must be some sort of highest good, because without that, there wouldn't be something for which each thing is being done. So you ask a series of why questions, and in a certain way, the why questions, or the what questions that are fundamentally why questions that Arthur asked Carlos, are exactly that kind of question. So for what purpose, to what end, with what goal, because of what are you doing these things? Most of the things which we measure success with are accumulations of means which allow us to reach ends. And we started off with the observation that wealth and comfort aren't sufficient to produce a feeling of happiness and contentment. And it's because those are fundamentally instrumental values rather than things with a certain kind of intrinsic meaning. And I would say what the philosophers give you are a set of tools for making it easier for you to be appreciative of the meaning in the world. So Aristotle says, just practice being the kind of person you want to become, and you're going to end up being that kind of person. Right? Fake it till you make it is in Aristotle's Ethics. If you want to become brave, act like a brave one, and brave is what you will become. And the realization that actually it doesn't all have to be internal, that in fact a lot of what makes it possible for us to behave in the ways that we wish we would is by surrounding ourselves by others who share our values, putting ourselves into social structures that reinforce those tendencies, and engaging in a consumption of what reaches us subconsciously, which is the aesthetic, the artistic, the representation in film, the representation in media, in such a way that it reinforces the values that we want to have. We cannot help what the entire back part and middle part of our brain does with stuff. And most of what we consume, everything we consume, goes there first. So what I would say the key of the practical strategies that we get from the philosophers is figure out where you want to go, and then use these tools, the tools of habit, the tools of social structures, and the tools of basically subconscious training and persuasion of yourself through engagement with the aesthetic to get those parts in line.
I mean, again, I just want to emphasize that there is something very strikingly optimistic about this. So there's another line in Aristotle that the most important things are always useless because you only want them for themselves. You don't want them for something else. You're not going to go get a friend so that you can like use them for you just want them because you have a friend.
And by the way, let me emphasize this for a second, because you just said this incredibly important thing.
Yeah.
One of the modern innovations in our social life is that we don't have real friends. We have deal friends.
Yeah.
And you know the difference between deal and real. Every single one of you knows them. You know what deal friends are? They're useful. You know what Aristotle would say real friends are? They're atelic, aka useless, not worthless. I have those too. Right? So are you lonely? You need more useless people in your life.
Yeah.
The bottom line. The people you can't, they're not good for anything to lift you up.
And that you're
in terms of physical things, right?
That you're useless to them as well.
Yeah, you just love them. Ordinarily, so Aristotle's really interesting. Is he talks about useless friends, what they have in common is that you have a shared love for a third thing, right? You have that shared, and maybe it's building birdhouses. Yeah. Maybe it's watching The Office. That's a beautiful third thing. But you know what? They better not get you promotions at your job, because then they'll go from real to deal, and it's just not good.
That's great. Let's go to the audience and take some questions. So down here first.
Hey, I'm Bart. I'm from Poland. I was at your previous lecture, and from what I gathered from what you've said, that we are in the crisis of love in this society, essentially. And I wanted to ask you, I deal a lot with politics. We are nearing Polish elections, parliamentary elections in a deeply polarized country, same as yours. How do you imagine a process in which people get closer together again? How does it work? Because we're in the realm of theoretical right now. I want to get practical.
So I would say, so how do we solve the political situation in Poland? And a question about which I have great expertise. I am actually married to a Hungarian, so I can say some countries are having an even harder time than your country is. But I think the Aristotelian idea that what you want to do is to find a common source of shared interests. So listen to the story that was just told, right? What is an authentic friend, right? Aristotle also says a friend is a second self. And the idea is it is somebody who shares an interest with you from a different perspective. And the key to rebuilding civil society is to identify points of common ground. So the center has in common with the left a real concern for equality. The center has in common with the right a real concern for not losing track of what we've spent thousands of years making sense of. And I don't have a tactic, but at least I know what the goal is, which is within each of these perspectives, there's a deep truth. There's something fundamentally important about human life. Nobody thinks of themselves as the bad guy. Nobody thinks of themselves as the bad guy. So when somebody's telling you to make your bed and eat keto, it's because they think that's going to make your life better. What are they getting at that is valuable that you might have been missing? You might not take it as extremely as they do. That's the goal that you have to be striving for, but I don't have the sociological or political scientific training to tell you what tactics you would use to get there.
Well, there's one cheat code, by the way, that comes from each one of us as opposed to our society. None of you is going to stop polarization. But you know what each one of you can do? Here's the cheat code. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's the cheat code. Are you up for it? Martin Luther King gave a sermon on November 17th, 1957 at the Dexter Street Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama on Matthew 5:44, love your enemies. And he said, Jesus didn't say to like your enemies. To like is a sentimental something, he said. Jesus said to love your enemies because to love is an act of will and commitment. It's an act of strength. That is truly countercultural. You know what's conventional? You know what's boring and conventional? Hating your enemies. Oh yeah, no, they're so misguided, all those people who vote for that guy. Ugh, they're ruining our country because they're so stupid. What a bunch of rubes that they actually believe these politicians or that media that say this and that. That's just so conventional and so boring to do that. You want to stand up to the man, the 7% of our culture that's trying to fire you up. See, when you hate, somebody else profits and it's not you. You want to stand up to the outraged industrial complex? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. It's worth a shot.
There's another question here.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi,
So
Pamela.
this is great,
Hi,
first of all. Fantastic. Thank you very much. The whole panel has been wonderful. I wanted to push a little bit on the question of authentic friends because we're in a moment now where people are very focused on what they call allies. And allies are actually useful tools, right? They're self-interested and it's externally validated. It's a transactional relationship. It's mutually beneficial. It's not something, not a relationship like a friendship where you would sacrifice something if it's not in your own self-interest. But allies do share something in common, right? So how would we tell, especially young people who are very focused on this, how to make that distinction, how to be a friend, and how to find friends, real friends, as opposed to allies?
I might actually say something about this one. So I think the key point is that kind of friendship that you're talking about is also for a useless thing. So if you have a friend for the sake of justice, that's actually incredibly beautiful, right? You're sharing in something beyond just the two of you like wanting to get rich together. And that version, I think, totally fits the paradigm that Arthur is talking about, which is the purpose of the friendship is actually a belief that life is meaningful. Yeah, I don't know if either of you want to comment on this as well.
I would love to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah.
It's going to be so good.
So, Pam, first of all, let me say it's an outstanding question to ask. And I would say one of the things to remember is we actually are also practical human beings, right? This has been a set of abstract discussions. I taught a course this term where we read Plato's Republic, but we also made TikTok videos. And the theme of the course is how do you make something that's methodologically appropriate for the moment? To say that it's really important to have friends isn't to say that it's not important to have allies. It isn't to say that it's not important to have just a sort of fundamental relation of trust with individuals around you. Yeah. When I gave that remark in response to the question about Poland, that was, here's the way in which we can build civil society, it's also really important when you have a set of incentive structures that are putting into place people with dictatorial and authoritarian tendencies to get together a bunch of people practically to resist that. So what I would say is, having friends doesn't preclude having allies. Having allies doesn't preclude having friends. And one of the lovely things about having multi-part souls, which all of us do, is that it's really easy to be polyphonic. We have all sorts of things that we can use. And if you want to connect with people by marching in unison with them, you can guarantee that you will feel close to them because there's a fundamental system in you. And the answer ultimately is a Socratic one, which is the more you have self-knowledge, the more awareness you have of these multiple mechanisms by which you can affect your behavior and your responses, the better you're going to be in terms of living the life that you want to live.
Wonderful. And one nuance to add to that, by the way, when you talk about the love for the mutual third thing, it's not the same thing as the hatred for a mutual third person.
Yeah.
That's the reason that allies that are allied in the hatred for another group or another ideology or another country or another movement, that doesn't work. That's no good. So if you're allied because you love the third thing, then that's what Aristotle would call the perfect friendship, right? But that he never talks about the perfect friendship that comes from mobilizing around your shared disgust for, you know, those people is what it comes down to. And that, in point of fact, is the problem that we have in an identity-based culture that's actually protesting against everyone and everything that's not us, it's them. That's the actual problem.
All right, this has been delightful. I'm afraid your questions will have to come directly bombarding the stage after this session. It's been a delight. Thank you all very much.